Hey, everybody. Welcome into the back room. I'm Andy Ostroy. We have Andrew Weissmann back with us. We'll chat with Andrew in just a moment. But first, thanks for tuning in. We appreciate you listening, and we'd love to hear your comments. So email us at backroomandy@gmail.com and or post on our social media, and we'll read some feedback next time. And if you like the podcast, please rate and review and follow or subscribe, and you'll be notified every time we post a new episode. So Andrew Weissmann is the co-host of the popular podcast Main Justice and is a frequent legal analyst for NBC and MS Now. He serves on the board of Just Security and writes frequently for it, as well as the New York Times, the Atlantic, and the Washington Post. From 2017 to 2019, Andrew served as a lead prosecutor in Robert Mueller's Special Counsel's office. His memoir about the Special Counsel investigation, Where Law Ends, Inside the Mueller Investigation, was a New York Times bestseller. He is also a professor of practice at New York University and teaches courses in national security and criminal procedure. He also served as the General Counsel for the FBI, and from 2002 to 2005, he served as the deputy and then the director of the Enron Task Force, where he supervised the prosecution of more than 30 individuals in connection with the company's collapse. And he was also a federal prosecutor for 15 years in the Eastern District of New York, where he served as the chief of the criminal division and prosecuted numerous members of the Colombo, Gambino, and Genovese families, including the bosses of the Colombo and Genovese families. And he's here today to discuss his new book, Liar's Kingdom: How to Stop Trump's Deceit and Save America, which goes on sale May 19th. Andrew, welcome back into the back room.
It is really nice to be here.
Congrats on the book, Liar's Kingdom: How to Stop Trump's Deceit and Save America. It's on sale May 19th, and I hope everybody will go out and buy this book. It's a fantastic read. So tell us about the book and what motivated you to write it now, especially about this one aspect of Donald Trump's character and presidency.
That is a good question. It started with my thinking about my experience in my own career. I was a prosecutor for 21 years at the Department of Justice. And I was thinking about all of the ways that I had seen, both because I was responsible for the case personally, or I'd supervised a case, or I knew about a case, where people were prosecuted for lying in various iterations, whether it's lying to the FBI, lying to a prosecutor, lying to Congress. I worked on the Enron case, lying to the public about the state of Enron. Vincent Gigante lying about his mental state. And I describe that sort of in a vivid part of my my experience as a young prosecutor. And I then looked at the fact that there are all sorts of ways civilly people are held to account for lying. And I obviously followed the doings in the civil case against Rudy Giuliani by Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss, two election workers in Georgia, for defamation. And I thought, look, there are all these ways, criminally and civilly, that we hold people to account for saying something that is not true. Not making a mistake, just to be clear. It has to be deliberate, like false, or recklessly false. And there's a court process. I mean, it's not like it's a fiat that you get due process. But I was like, how is it that we do not hold candidates or politicians to account for lying? And like, how is it that we're saying that lying about the ballot box is less important than lying about a stock certificate? It just seemed to be, maybe that says a lot about America, but that's what got me thinking about, is there something we can do about lies? And thought about a sort of euphemistically thinking about it as a sort of truth in advertising law or rule. And that led me to dig deeper on the law here in the United States, also the law it turns out there's very little that's done federally, but at the state level, we're both New Yorkers, and the New York has a statute that's a disqualification statute if you are found guilty of various crimes, including fraud, and violating your oath of office. And then you are automatically rendered ineligible for public office. And then I started looking overseas, and seeing what do other countries do. And then really thought about what are the various possibilities that could happen here? What are the challenges to it? So that's a long answer to sort of what got me started and why I was thinking about this.
And I do want to get to the other countries in a moment, but I want to ask you, because we know from experience with Donald Trump that he is like no other president, certainly like no other candidate we've ever had for president. The lies are just nonstop. I mean, they're 24/7. He lies like you and I breathe. So is there a double standard for him? Like when you question, why don't we hold politicians accountable for lies, or elevating it to the next level, why isn't he sued for defamation? Like, is there just a double standard for him? Does he get away with not just lying, but the blatant corruption? Like, we both remember days where, like, if a president did something that was not above board and it was corrupt, there'd be consequence, at least investigations, some kind of attempt at accountability would happen. We live in a different era right now. He just does whatever he wants, and the Congress is complicit because they've abdicated their constitutional responsibilities. Is it just different for him?
So the answer, I think, is yes. And there's sort of that seems like a complicated topic. On what I would say is maybe good news is, in that I agree with you that there is a double standard, is when we're seeing bad behavior, and that might be putting it mildly, by male politicians and other men in power with respect to women. The Teflon that seems to have largely, not entirely, but largely protected the president, certainly protected the president from political ramifications. It hasn't protected him from legal ramifications, CEG, the E. Jean Carroll case, which she won both of her cases. They're on appeal, but she won at the trial level. That there does seem to be this double standard, because you do still see enormous ramifications. Some people listening to this would say not enough, but I think you see more than certainly for Donald Trump. He would say, and certainly Todd Blanche has said for him, that, oh no, there is no double standard. He was held to account more than other people. He was indicted 4 times, but I think the counter to that is because of his conduct. In other words, this is one where one of the things I keep on saying when I'm on air on MS Now and I'm a broken record, or so we're both dog lovers, so I'll say like a dog with a bone, is facts matter. Right. To sit there and say it's all equivalence, and that you did it too, is no. Facts matter. That would be a perfectly good argument if there was nothing to, for instance, the Mar-a-Lago case. But obviously it didn't go to trial, but we know a lot about it. If there was nothing to the insurrection case, but a lot of that we either saw with our eyes or we've seen the evidence that was adduced by the January 6th committee. And so one way of dealing with this, and it's kind of a transition to my thinking about foreign countries, and is our country gets an F in terms of holding political leaders to account, with all of the ramifications that we are living through now. But if you were in Brazil, Bolsonaro was convicted of engaging in insurrection. And I described the extraordinary way in which his career and his actions, up to and including the way he talked about and treated women, he went to trial. He was given due process under Brazilian law, and he was convicted. And the same thing in France. You have Marine Le Pen, who was charged with and found guilty of fraud. One of the sanctions for her was a temporary disqualification. Sarkozy, the former president, has been convicted, I'm sorry to say, repeatedly. And so those are examples of countries that have a far better record of holding political leaders to account. And if we don't get better at that, then we have only ourselves to blame when we have politicians who commit crimes. If we're just going to look the other way or say, no, we're not going to do that, because if we do that, we'll lead to tit for tat prosecutions. That's another way of saying, well, we're never going to hold anyone to account, no matter how serious the crime. And I think that's part of the reason on the 250th anniversary of our country, we're in the shape we're in.
Is there a flaw in our system, or did the framers create a system that would work if we had co-equal branches of government that did their job?
I think the answer is sort of both. I mean, look, the Constitution has done pretty darn well for a long time, but I think that we are seeing that certain things, that certain checks and balances are not working. One obvious one that would absolutely take a constitutional amendment to change is the pardon power, the federal pardon power. And again, to be fair, we have seen abuses by other presidents, but nothing on this scale, where you have the weaponization of DOJ to bring cases against enemies, and then the pardoning of friends, and the complete eradication of sort of blind justice. It's the antithesis of that. And we have, this is not an observation that's new to me, the rise of political parties that was not foreseen by the framers. And that meant that what we're seeing now is not just the extraordinary rise of the executive power, but the fact that Congress is not playing that third role. And so we are really seeing just two branches of government. And I think for a lot of people, they're saying we're not always seeing it from the Supreme Court of the United States. It's highly sporadic, but we certainly are seeing it, I think, at the lower courts, in the judiciary, but we're not seeing it from Congress. And what that leads to is the president feeling, I can do stuff and don't have to worry about Congress taking action. In my view, that's in part what's going on now. We're in the middle of a war, and the Congress hasn't declared the war, and they're not doing anything to exert their power. That power is given solely to Congress. But if they don't exert it, if they don't say this is our power, then the Constitution is just a piece of paper. And it doesn't have any meaning. I think similarly, part of what could have motivated the Supreme Court in the Calais decision, the redistricting case that just came out, was their knowing that Congress is highly unlikely, to take action to put teeth back into the Voting Rights Act and to sort of stand up to what the Supreme Court has done. And that's something we have seen in the past from time to time, but at this point, we have an incredibly somnambulent third branch of government. So we really just have two in operation, and you have the other two branches, whether it's the judiciary or the executive, taking advantage of that situation.
Yeah, well, we live in a climate right now where whatever Donald Trump says, Congress abides by that. They're complicit. Same with the conservative justices for the most part of the Supreme Court. So you're right.
I would say for the most part, I mean, we should remember, I mean, just to not paint with a total broad brush, in the tariff decision, you will remember just that the evening of it coming out, Donald Trump has a bit of a meltdown in the White House, excoriating two of the justices, Justice Gorsuch and Justice Amy Coney Barrett. And it seemed to me, his view was like, how could you vote against me when I was the one who nominated you? As if that quid pro quo was a given, which is so antithetical to what the law is supposed to be. So, and Justice Gorsuch in particular had very strong words about the role of Congress and how the executive branch, really shouldn't overstep.
Yeah. Well, that's why I said for the most part.
Yeah,
because
you're absolutely right.
Because you're right. But sticking with redistricting for a second, it is abundantly clear that Donald Trump has given the order, I need to fix this election. Okay. We, the party, we need to fix this election. We need to do whatever humanly possible to do that. He gave his marching orders. The states, the southern states, Republican states, have immediately kicked into high gear with redistricting, redrawing the maps. Unlike the Democratic states, they don't care what the voters think. They just went ahead if they control the legislatures, and they did it. And for the most part, with the Supreme Court, they're the rubber stamp. And it's not surprising. I mean, if we go back 26 years, the Supreme Court, which never gets involved in state constitutional matters, of course, got involved in Florida state constitutional matters. And they literally decided who was going to be president. So that's kind of what I'm referring to, because the premise of your book, in large part, is it's not just about his lying, but it's about 2020 and the big lie. And he's repeating, it's the same playbook. And he has a complicit Congress and, for the most part, as we've seen recently, a complicit Supreme Court who's helping him disenfranchise voters, Democratic voters, and helping him, even worse, disenfranchising voters of color. And so it's like we've turned this country back 50, 60, 70 years, and there's nothing we can do about it because, like you said before, he gives the order, and that's the landscape we're living in right now.
Yeah. So God, there's so much to say about that. Just to focus on race for the moment, because one of the things that was so upsetting about the Supreme Court LA decision was that you have the court unilaterally deciding, we don't, essentially, this is my take, we don't really need the Voting Rights Act anymore. That racism is beyond, we're beyond that.
Well, it's like what Ruth Bader Ginsburg said in 2013. You don't get rid of the umbrella because you're standing under an umbrella and you're dry, and therefore feel like you don't need the umbrella anymore because you're dry. It's insane.
Exactly. And it also wasn't for them to say that. I mean, Congress is perfectly capable of, if they think their law is no longer needed, to say we're going to change or sunset the Voting Rights Act. And just think about the idea that the Voting Rights Act that was put in place to make it harder to discriminate against minority groups in this country, that the moment where the Supreme Court chooses to gut that is the moment that I think we have the most racist White House that I have ever seen. Starting with the Obama birther movement, and you could give examples, over and over and over again. And to me, that was just blinking at reality that would be the decision now. It is, though, just to your sort of what we can do. Obviously,
and by the way, the same could be said about the Roberts Court, if you really want to break it down. That is one of the most racist courts in American history.
Well, because certainly the effect of this is one where it just seems so hard to ignore that fact. But that's where, I was thinking for this book, I was very much focused on, if we ever get out of this, what can we do? And what can we do systemically? What are norms that haven't worked that we now need to think about? What laws can we have? Some of it can be done by statute, some of it can be done by the states, some of it unfortunately would need a constitutional amendment. But it's still like, law is, I come from a family of scientists. In science, there's this objective reality, and you can't, like, there's going to be a cure for cancer or not. It doesn't, but with law, we get to create the society we want. And some of the things will be harder than others, but I think it's really important for people to think about that. Now, that is slightly long-term. In terms of the midterms, which are, that is coming right around the corner, people should not despair. First of all, none of this redistricting affects Senate races because, the voting doesn't work that way. It affects House races. And so, not that that's unimportant, but like it's worth keeping that in perspective. And it means that getting the vote out is going to be really, really important. Whatever side you're on, it's like that is, but for me, I very much vote on the rule of law issues. So I think it's going to be really important to make sure people don't feel demoralized and have despair. Because, as a friend of mine said, it's not like just take an example from the civil rights movement. I mean, a lot of things are not easy and take a lot of courage and tenacity, and you have to think about having that long term.
Yeah. Well, I think the frustration and the heartache is because we look at the civil rights movement of the 60s, and then we say, okay, it's 60 years later, and this is where we are. It almost feels like on a lot of levels, we're right back where we were in this country in terms of dealing with race, in terms of people of color having equal representation. Everybody's talking about the districts being cut up, but, the more important result of this is that representation gets changed dramatically. And, that's the part that I think is really upsetting.
Can I tell you an anecdote? Do you remember the Pink Pussycat protests that were happening around the country after Donald Trump was elected? I was in Washington, D.C. at the time. I was working for the government, and what I did that day is I got a ticket to the African American Museum, which is one of the newer museums on the mall. And, in the museum, you could hear all the chanting because the parade was just huge demonstration. And it sort of spilled out way beyond where it was supposed to be because it was just everywhere. And I am leaving, and I'm looking out, and there's a sea of pink pussycat hats and lots of signs, and the atmosphere was lovely and warm, and it was restorative, I think, for lots of people. And one of the signs I saw being held up outside as I'm looking out from the African American Museum on the mall was, "I can't believe we still are protesting this shit."
Yeah.
And it was that idea that, you think that we're always making progress and we're bending towards justice. And, what we've seen is that's not the case. And one of the things you learn from, I've learned at least from Trump 2.0, and I think it was true for 1.0 also, is that we take a lot of things for granted, and that the roots of our democracy are not as deep as we thought they were. And it's really going to take renewed commitment. And I do really keep thinking about the fact that it's the 250th anniversary of our country. And it given where we are, to me, it's a bit of a wake-up call.
Oh, huge ass wake-up call. This country is 250 years old, and we're in a lot of ways, we're going backwards. With redistricting, I do think there's a pretty significant chance that this could all backfire on the Republican Party, because they have a knack for having things backfire when there's overreach like this. And if you just look at what could likely happen, First of all, the assumption that everyone's going to vote the way you think they're going to vote is wrong. Okay, so that's problem perhaps number one. But in a wave election, if you take a strong red district and now all of a sudden the margins are slimmer, and if Democrats do have a blue wave election, that could backfire on Republicans in districts that they think they're going to get. So it's frustrating to see it all happen, but we may look back after the election and realize like it just didn't matter at all.
Yeah, I mean, I hope you're right. That it doesn't matter. And to me, the solution is that redistricting, which obviously from time to time has to happen as we do a census, as opposed to this sort of mid-census.
Right.
And here it's just, it's like slightly before the election, and in fact, in some states it's during. So people should know, like in some states, it was actually the primaries that actually the voting had started, and it was like, wait, stop the presses.
Mm-hmm.
But you're right that I hadn't really thought of it that way. That the example that Elena Kagan gave in Dissent, it was this beautiful dissent in the Calais case, was you take a majority minority district and you carve it up, and so that you sort of parcel it out to other districts, so that there's now no longer a minority district, meaning a majority of the people are minorities. But it is true that you are, to the extent that you may have closer elections in those other districts, because you're dividing up what you think are Democratic votes, so that you haven't centralized them, so that you're essentially, by doing that, you can sort of staunch the bleeding if you think this is going to be a particularly bad election, and thought about the idea that by diversifying them, at least you may make those other, or certainly a number of those, even if not all of them, competitive when they had not been. So that's a great point. I'm obviously the devil's.
Well, you're making you make some of your own red districts less red, which leaves you exposed in a wave election. Yes. So let's get back to the lies. Okay, so I know the big lie, 2020, is probably number one on your list. But give us an example of a few of the lies that you feel have been the most consequential and dangerous.
Well, that's one of the hard parts of this book was, I tried to write something that was
which one of the 100,000 lies should I choose to focus on?
Exactly. So I wanted this to be kind of short and sweet. And I have this chapter called The Honesty Crisis. And I was dealing with this issue of, okay, I can't pick all of them because this is like just a little data. During Trump's first term, the Washington Post kept a running tally of over 30,000 presidential utterances that they cataloged as false or misleading. And that comes to a prodigious average of 20.9 each day. So it became
that doesn't even seem like a lot, because you could listen to him give an address for an hour and it feels like there's 100 lies just in that hour. 1 hour.
Yeah, so maybe you should take that up with Washington Post. They're counting.
Yeah.
So what I did is I decided to take like one that people could see and recognize, and they knew was significant. But I'll give you one that's personal, and of course it's not in any way representative. But not that long ago, when we were still talking about the Epstein files, the president of the United States said, well, I hear that Andrew Weissman's all over those Epstein files. And so friends of mine were like, oh, so tell me about the island. And I was like, too soon. And of course, it's absolutely 100% false. I mean, there's nothing, never, know how.
So you're not even in there, like even in some tangential reference. Like there are people who are in the Epstein files because somebody said, "Hey, if you need a good lawyer, call Bob Smith." So Bob
Yeah,
Smith is
yeah,
in the
yeah.
Epstein files, but he's not. It's like such an
Yeah,
innocuous reference.
I have no idea whether while I was doing something high profile, whether there was some article or anything, but that certainly has not been called to my attention. And to the extent that this was trying to suggest that I've never, I've never met him, spoke to him, communicated with him in any. It was all just made up. And again, that is just something I could see because I knew personally that's
How does it? Let me ask you this, because I don't think I've ever heard anyone ask you this, and I think it is something that we all wonder and think about. What is it like to be the subject of a Donald Trump lie? How does that make you feel when all of a sudden you are thrust into the national spotlight, not because of the work you do or some accomplishment you've made, but because this maniac decides to lie about you?
So I still remember the first time I was working for Robert Mueller when he was special counsel. And I don't remember what it was that was said, but the president mentioned me by name in some derogatory fashion. It was definitely not positive. Um, and it's so disconcerting, but I can honestly tell you that my first reaction was, doesn't he have anything better to do? I mean, I literally was thinking, how does I mean, I have a big ego, I think, but I don't have such a big ego that I think my name or conduct or abilities should be on the radar screen of what's supposed to be the leader of the free world. And then I was just stunned at that. Then, of course, it is disconcerting. But then what happens is with Donald Trump, if you've got the Washington Post reporting 30,000 lies just in the first term, I mean, it does become background noise.
Right.
I was one of the people, I recount this in the book, that was the subject of not one, but two executive orders. But one of them was stripping me of my security clearance. By the way, at the time that I didn't have security clearance, I'd left government, so it was all very performative. But the names, the people were Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, and Hillary Clinton. I mean, these exalted people who had done so much for the country in so many different ways. So I was just this little bit player, and so that just doesn't really register on the radar screen for something like that.
Is there a qualitative and quantitative difference in Trump's lies this term so far versus his first term?
I don't think so. I think what there is greater complicity by people around him. And I think that we're living through a bit of a science experiment where, to the extent that people in Trump 1.0 who were around Donald Trump, who were saying, we're helping, we're controlling his worst instincts, I think that you're seeing the difference between Trump 1.0 and the Trump 2.0, and that the president has learned that it seems like the number one qualification for most of the people, or certainly many of the people in his administration, is loyalty rather than excellence at the job. And you know where you see this? When you see people being nominated, whether it's to be a judge of all things, where you're going to be, you're supposed to be independent, or for any position in the government, and they refuse to just say the obvious fact when they're asked about, was there material fraud in the election, and they just say Joe Biden was inaugurated as our president, which of course is like, that's not answering the question. To me, what is going on is that the president is creating this test, which is I need to test your loyalty that you are willing to lie for me. And then if you are willing to lie for me, I know that you're willing to lie for me. You now know that you're willing to lie for me to get the job. So I know that like I can count on you. And this is the secret handshake that we're all going to be on this page. And that to me is one of the things that I'm trying to figure out how to counteract with this idea of, if you, for instance, had a criminal law that said you cannot lie under oath to the public, and it wasn't just you can't lie to Congress or you can't lie to a bank. I mean, those are all on the books now. But, why should a candidate for office be able to lie with impunity? Why should anybody who's in elected office or appointed office be able to lie? We don't allow it in so many other settings. And aren't we entitled? I mean, this is very sort of, naive, but it's like, aren't we entitled to more? And if we don't ask for more, aren't we sort of deserve what we get?
Yeah, well, that's an excellent point, and it's real. And when you couple that with the misrepresentations of AI, the recreations, the deep fake, I mean, it is terrifying what the public is actually getting these days. There's a lot of people who listen to Donald Trump and they believe that anything he says is the truth. And then Congress backs him up. And so the public, they're not obsessed with politics the way some of us are. And they get up and they go to work, they take care of their kids. They don't have time for a lot of news. And the president says something, Congress says something, must be true. Scary.
One of the things, I totally agree with you, and the media environment we're in is making this problem worse and worse and exacerbates it. It's one of the reasons, one of the more unusual things that happened this past year was the video of Alex Preddy being killed.
Right.
Because that was an example where so many people could actually see it for themselves,
right,
and could make a judgment about what they saw versus what they were being told. Now, counter that with I don't have like rose-colored glasses on this, because that's one example, but the other is the administration's effort to completely whitewash what happened on January 6th, and we saw images that were equally vivid that you could look at yourself to see what was going on. And that is now being couched by the president, by the acting attorney general, and many, many others as something where the people who were trying to prevent it and who were investigating it and then prosecuted it, they're the bad guys. Mm-hmm. And the people who were attacking the Capitol and the police, they're the good guys. They're in the process of not only getting pardons, but now suing to get money, which is
absurd.
This is the world, topsy-turvy, and that's the polite term.
Yeah. So one of the themes, a big theme of the book, is accountability. Why do you think so many institutions, legal, political, the media, repeatedly fail to hold Trump accountable in real time? And I guess I want to ask, are we no longer fearing an autocracy? Are we actually living in one? Is that the answer?
Well, so I do think that we are in many ways living in a society that has, I won't say full autocracy, because you know why? Because we're doing this, we're having this, and people are still speaking out and writing and have demonstrations and voting. So it's not a full-on autocracy, but many of the institutions that separate us from an autocracy are failing. And what does it have to do with? Lack of principle, a fear of retribution and violence, money, power. We see that whether we're dealing with businesses that cave, media that caves, law firms that cave. Remember when Mitt Romney, a senator, said you wouldn't be surprised that the number of senators who said that they know exactly what's going on and what Donald Trump did, but they're afraid
Right.
to speak out?
Do you think the same holds true for the media? I mean, we watch them now. They literally just sit and let Trump talk. There's no Sam Donaldson. There's no Jim Acosta. There's no one fact checking or giving any pushback. And even worse, when a reporter asks him a totally legit question, they get called dumb, stupid, horrible, the enemy of the people, traitors, especially women. How responsible is the media for where we are right now?
So I think they have their share of blame, but I feel like I feel like that's looking not at the biggest problem, which is the administration that's causing it. Um, the what's going on at CBS, I think, is just appalling. I can give an example that's also from my book. Again, a small example, but I have a wonderful, wonderful publisher, and I had a fantastic editor at Little Brown. They were not the first publisher. This book was going to be published by a different publisher. And when the president issued his executive order in this past spring, where I was named, they backed out.
Wow.
They were too scared. And this is a publishing house. I mean, if there's any institution that should be defending the First Amendment, you think it would be a publishing house. And frankly, like CBS, a news organization. So fear, power, money, all of those can play a part. But, I do think there still are journalists that are doing a really good job. So, it's obviously I'm not. I think it's a bell curve, like a lot of things. And I think there's some journalists, even when the Washington Post was completely, in my view, sort of cratering, there were still journalists there who I just thought the world of. It's the same
Yeah,
thing.
I mean, when you think about like in the room, in the White House briefing room, or when there's a gaggle, the White House correspondence. I think Caitlin Collins does an amazing job. I think
Exactly.
we've seen people like Andrew Feinberg push back hard. But I got to say, in this last 6, 8, 12 months, there's not a whole lot of them, and no one comes to the aid of anyone else. No one says, why are if you don't want to answer the question, don't answer the question. But why are you personally attacking us? What is that? I would love to have somebody say, sir, what does it say about your character and temperament that you issue these personal attacks when you are simply asked a question by a free press? And I'm not even talking about trying to fact check the lies, which just come at
I know
it's disheartening to watch.
Things. I know. I had the same reaction when Pam Bondi, as the Attorney General, was, I can't even say testifying, when she was doing whatever she was doing before Congress. And it was like, I mean, if it weren't so serious, it was like a child. And you just wanted to be like, okay, let's assume all of your attacks on the senator asking questions are true. Let's assume that they're just a horrible, horrible person. Now answer the question.
No, it reminded me of like Jim Carrey in I think it was Ace Ventura, when somebody says something to me he doesn't like, he's like, oh yeah, well, you're stupid, you're ugly, you're fat. It's like
Exactly.
like a child would, but she was
5-year-old.
there kind of. What my takeaway from her was like, wow, she sounds like a girlfriend defending her boyfriend. Like that's, like she's the Attorney General of the United States. Just think about that for a second. There are people who have served, on both sides of the aisle, whether you agreed with their politics, if they showed their politics, they still had respect for the institution and self-respect. That performance was bonkers. I mean, bonkers.
I mean, not that long ago, Attorney General Sessions, who was, very much loyal to Donald Trump as a candidate, and he was his first Attorney General. He was axed because he understood that the Department of Justice was not just a toy to be used at will by the President of the United States to go after political enemies, and that he understood the role. I mean, it was sort of remarkable, but like he, as a longtime senator, really understood and had lived through Watergate and understood. Started by talking about norms. He understood the importance of the norm of the separation of the White House from the Department of Justice. And that's when we're acting Attorney General Todd Blanche. I don't know if you saw this recently, like when he was asked about this, sort of pulls out with great fanfare the pocket Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
And it just missed the point. The issue was not that the president doesn't have the power to direct the attorney general to do this. It's that that this is not something that he should be doing. That's not a power that the reason it's a norm is because people decided post Watergate that it's not appropriate for the president to be exercising the power that way. But under the Constitution, of course, he can. But that's like, no one's arguing that he can't, that it's a question that he is illegal in doing it. It's a question that he should not be doing it. It's not healthy for the country or the rule of law. And of course, there's no way that Todd Blanche doesn't know that.
Well, I've interviewed a lot of people who have worked with him in the past, who know him, and they all say, this is not the Todd Blanche I knew. I guess you could ask this of anybody in his cabinet, but what happened to Todd Blanche? Where does somebody like that make a turn so dramatically where they either completely lose sight of who or what they're supposed to be loyal to, or they know exactly, like you're implying, but have just chosen to go for the money, the power, the greed, the access, whatever, pick your poison?
I don't know. I have heard the same thing, though, from colleagues. He was a prosecutor in the Southern District of New York. It's a very revered institution. He, I think, had a career quite admirably where he really worked his way up. He didn't have the same sort of fancy academic credentials, and all of that is to his credit. And you don't know if it is an effect of power, if it's a issue of, at times, I do question how much, whether he's I won't say being duped, but that whether he really understands how pernicious some of those positions are. What they did in the Eric Adams case, for instance, was absolutely appalling. To want him to be sort of a play toy for the Trump administration, and to have hanging over his head this sort of Damocles that if you don't help us essentially on immigration, we can reinstitute these charges against you. But the carrot is going to be that we sort of dismiss without prejudice, and the stick is going to be, if you don't do what we want, this is sort of the unwritten rule. It's like he's going to worry: are they going to reinstitute the charges? That has never ever happened, and that was why you saw so many career people resigning from the Southern District. That's why you then had all this strong arming of people, the public integrity section, to get them to do their bidding. But I don't know what it is that causes people to change or become the way they are, and whether I suspect that there's no one answer for everyone, and but I don't know him well enough to know the answer about like why he is like he is, but I do wonder what his red lines are, like what
if he has
he
them.
is. what does he say? We learned that, unfortunately, but we learned that at the end of 2020, when we saw that the red lines were not engaging in insurrection. And Bill Barr was not willing to do that. And I'm no fan of his, but he had
But he never said, I love Donald Trump either, like Todd Blanche did recently.
Yes, exactly.
So that might be an indication of where the red lines may or may not be. In our last couple of minutes, I want to revisit the title of the book and sort of revisit the question or the premise. So that is, how do we stop Trump's deceit?
So I think with respect to Trump himself, I think that the answer really is voting. But I'm really focusing on sort of what do we do with all of the people, and by the way, this could be Republicans and Democrats and independents, the politicians, candidates, anybody who holds public office at the state or federal level. Why should there not be truth in advertising? Why should there not be laws that either criminalize what they're doing if it's an intentional lie with due process, just to be clear? I've been a prosecutor and defense lawyer for too long to not understand how important that is. And if necessary, for some of this, a constitutional amendment. I'm perfectly aware that does not make it a sort of an easy lift. But I do think it's important for people to really be thinking about, in reading this, you may agree with parts of it, you may disagree with parts of it, but just start thinking about how do we build stronger checks and balances that are not just norms.
And the media's role in this turnaround?
So that's one where I will go back to something I said, which is that I think it's very important to not cover adjectives and adverbs as if that's the story. That's not a story. It's fine to say, if you have something particularly outrageous that the president said, that you need to say he said X, because the language is so coarse or it's so not true. But you need to cover the facts of the story. It is not partisan to present the facts and to say this is not what the actual facts are. And I think it requires a level of maturity and depth and attention by the American public. But I think that the media has to do a better job than not taking the sort of the easiest spoon-fed story and just sort of repeating it as if it's like, oh, now I've got content to give to people, without doing the legwork of presenting what the actual facts are.
Andrew, you've been very generous with your time today. Love the insights. As always, the book again is Liar's Kingdom, How to Stop Trump's Deceit and Save America. It's on sale May 19th, and I hope you sell a bazillion books.
Thank you so much, Andy.
All righty. Take care. This episode was produced and edited by me, Andy Ostroy. It was co-produced by Maddie Rosenberg and Jen Hammoud for Radio Free Rhinecliff, with additional editing by Maddie Rosenberg, music by Andrew Hollander, and graphic design by Cricket Lengale. And with a special thanks to our sponsor, The Epicurean. Again, thanks for listening. Please rate and review wherever you get your podcasts, and subscribe to the Backroom with Andy Ostroy YouTube channel, where you can watch full videos of our interviews. See you next time.